The most widely published book in human history reveals that we are created in the image of God. Throughout our human journey, each encounter is an opportunity to see the shared humanity in ourselves and others. Regardless of one's views on religion, each experience and each story weaves us together towards a common path. A path of transformation, a process of growth and understanding, a recognition that, at our core, we share a common destiny. What does the search for truth really mean in our lives? How can we find a sense of unity in a world so diverse and divided? As we reflect on these questions, we start to uncover a fundamental connection that binds us all beyond our differences. Welcome to Created in the Image of God, Building Vibrant Communities, with our host, Wade Franson. Tonight's episode is Purim, Persia, and the Present.
Hello, everyone. It's Wade Franson, back with another episode of Created in the Image of God. Today, I have a guest in the studio that I have really been looking forward to interviewing. And the reason is our paths are like from parallel universes. Most of you in the audience know that I grew up in a sect, let's call it, that was kind of like Messianic Judaism in reverse. We kept the Passover, we kept the Jewish holy days, Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah. I grew up with that, and we had a unique identity within the Christian world. And, we're considered somewhat heretical outsiders because of some of our views. And here I have a person who grew up Jewish and has become Christian and has spent her life since adulthood in this space of the theology that relates to the identity of Christians, the identity of Jews. And you know that little symbol that people have on their bumpers of their cars that say coexist, and it seems like a glib soundbite? Jen has dedicated her life to this theologically for Christians and Jews. Welcome to the studio, Jen Rosner.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Well, it certainly is my honor, and it's a pleasure as well, as I mentioned. So, as we always do, we love to just dive into your creation story. You know, who were you before you took conscious thought? We believe on this show, Created in the Image of God, that God has worked with us, even not to get down a theological rat hole, but even pre-birth, right? And that there's a purpose that we were put on earth for, and God has been involved. And it's always fascinating to me to see how that unfolds in the context of free will and us having our own choices. So what was it like growing up, Jen, in a Jewish household?
Yeah, great place to start. So my parents are both Jewish. All of my grandparents are Jewish. My parents were both raised in the Jewish community in Los Angeles. My dad was raised in the conservative Jewish movement, if that means something to listeners. My mom was raised in the Reform Jewish movement. They got married in their early 20s, and they moved to Northern California, to Lake Tahoe, California, which is where I was born and raised. I don't think they were planning to stay. I think it was just, supposed to be a fun little stint, and they never left. And so I was born and raised in a small town in Northern California, with a mom who was very committed to raising us in Jewish rhythms of life and with a Jewish identity. But what's interesting about Judaism is that living Jewishly does not necessarily say something about one's theology. And so my mom, I think, would say that she was actually agnostic until well into their marriage, but she was very into sort of cultural Judaism and Jewish holidays. She was a Jewish camp counselor growing up in Los Angeles. So I remember being raised with, Hanukkah and Passover and an awareness of my Jewish identity. But that didn't necessarily map onto reading Bible, reading Torah, understanding and thinking about God. And my dad was kind of the opposite. He was also Jewish, but he had become pretty jaded towards the Jewish community in Los Angeles, which his experience of that was more of kind of like a class status thing than really a spiritual, meaningful religious community. And so my dad had a little bit of a bad taste in his mouth towards Judaism as like an organized religion, but he was a very deep spiritual seeker. And so he had sort of followed a couple different, spiritual leaders in the 1970s, was a little bit into like transcendental meditation and things like that. So I was raised with a very I guess maybe what we would call today like spiritual but not religious father, and a almost like religious but not spiritual mother who wanted to really keep Judaism alive in the home. And so I remember, I think as a child, I had a pretty elementary God concept. I remember my dad, kind of teaching us certain things that like God cared about how we lived our lives and God was looking out for us and protecting us. As I look back, I sometimes call it non-contextual monotheism. Like it certainly wasn't attached to like the story of the Jewish people or anything like that, but it was this God concept. And then, as I said, these sort of rhythms of Jewish holidays from my mom. At the time, the town that we grew up in, the only Jewish community, like organized community, was a Reform Jewish community, which I remember attending a Reform Jewish synagogue once as a child. And my parents just thought it was too liberal, like some iterations of Reform Judaism. Like I'm not even sure that the rabbi believed in God. And so especially for my dad, that was like not the place he was going to be raising his children. So we didn't really grow up with any like wider community. There was no congregation that we were a part of. It was very much in our home. Which is, most of Judaism takes place in the home anyway, but there wasn't a community or congregation that we went to. And so that was my upbringing, like understanding that I was Jewish. There were not a lot of Jews in our town. And so most of my friends were not Jewish. I remember one Jewish kid growing up who we went to school with who, was very secular. His family was very secular and kind of more politically liberal. My family was more politically conservative. So we didn't have a ton in common with them, but I just knew that he was this other Jewish kid and he was smart and he was valedictorian and all these things when we were in high school. And I did have, it's interesting looking back because my best friend growing up was actually Catholic. And, she wasn't, she didn't talk about Jesus all the time, but I actually remember like going to Catholic mass with her. And I don't have any, it's interesting to me that my parents were not threatened by that. Like my parents were okay with me going to mass with her. I don't remember having any remarkably striking spiritual experiences. I'm not sure that I totally understood what was going on. And so I actually did not hear the gospel understand who the person of Jesus was until I was in college, which is striking to me because not only was my best friend Catholic, but I had other like evangelical Christian friends growing up. And I guess none of them ever bothered to tell me like about Jesus.
So let me pause you there.
Sure.
And don't lose where we are in the story, but I want to address a couple of issues and probably the issue of identity.
Mm-hmm.
So I won't tell the story of how the Germans say the penny dropped. I lived for 10 years in Germany. When the penny dropped for me about how that is that you would grow up not questioning that, I realized at a deeply profound level, very, very relatively late in life, that everyone on earth thinks they're right. Mm-hmm. Whatever they were taught, whatever they were raised in, and whatever they believe at any point in our lives, we think we are right. Mm-hmm. And unless we sort of contest this within ourselves and examine it, it's a dogmatic thinking we're right to the point where, people talking to you about Jesus, it's water off a duck's back. Mm-hmm. And you would only engage with it if you were in some kind of confrontation, some kind of conflict about it. And then you would have the fight or flight reaction, right, related to that belief. But you would not actually objectively examine it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not sure how I would have reacted to someone telling me about Jesus. Like, I feel like, and that does actually relate to the next part of the story because, and then maybe I'll tell the next part of the story and then I can revisit your comment a bit. So the next part of the story is I went off to college and I went to a large public state school in California. It was where my brother went. I have one older brother and he was there. And I remember going to visit him when I was still in high school and just sort of falling in love with this college campus. And so I, graduated college and went there, joined my brother there. And, it's funny. It sort of just so happened that all of my friends as a freshman in college at this, again, completely secular state school were Christians. My randomly assigned college roommate was a Christian. My next door neighbor in the college dorms was a Christian who ended up becoming my best friend in college. And so all of a sudden I'm surrounded by Christians. It's a school called Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, for those who are interested. And it was a really interesting time at that campus because the Campus Crusade for Christ chapter, which is now called CRU, went from about 50 people to 500 people in about a 5-year period. And it's when I was there. So like something was going on at this campus among, Christians, like some kind of little mini revival or something. And so again, all of these kids in my randomly assigned freshman dorm were Christians. And I remember starting to attend church on Sundays with my roommate simply because I did not like being the only kid in the dorms on a Sunday morning. Like everybody was just going to church. And so I started going to a church. And then eventually I started going to Campus Crusade meetings because my, friends were involved in that. I eventually started going to Sunday church services for a vineyard church plant that many of my sort of friends and roommates were involved in. And so my college years really turned out to be this time of deep spiritual searching for me. And so to relate to your previous comment, I think that I had a certain openness about truth and God. So did I think I was sort of right growing up? I'm not sure because I didn't have, I don't think I had enough of a foundation to sort of even be comparing that to other people's spiritual frameworks. So I was just kind of fascinated. And I remember like I could tell you about some of the speakers who spoke at Campus Crusade like 25 years ago. It really made an impression on me to be in these spaces and then to be having.
So hold that thought again, because I want to go back to this. So this was the other comment I was going to make is that with your mother and father being mirror images of each other, and I assume they had a relatively happy marriage, and it was a relatively happy situation, and so you grew up in a situation where two very different perspectives and takes on life lived right next to each other. So your sort of dogmatic identity would have been already more open naturally.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And I think, just to comment on that, I think as I got older, as children do, I started to see that I think there was a bit of tension between my parents on these issues. I think that my mom, again, really struggled to instill in us a Jewish identity. And she was the one who took the lead. Like when we would do family Passover Seders, it was my mom leading. And, maybe a little bit metaphorically speaking, my dad sort of leaning back with his arms crossed, like he wasn't really engaged in that because of his experience of Judaism growing up. But then he was the one who I remember having the more like sort of God concept kinds of conversations with. So I think, my parents have a wonderful marriage. They just this year celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. So,
wow.
They have been a real model in terms of exactly what you're talking about. They're very different in many ways. So that's a really interesting point that I was maybe already even sort of subconsciously watching two people who are pretty different, living that out in a very healthy way. So, so it's a great observation. It's a really interesting thing for me to think about and reflect on. And I think it actually relates to their response to my journey in college. So I had, started attending these Christian things. Interestingly, my brother, who was at the same college, was involved with a similar group of people. And so he was on a similar journey. And my last year in college, through a, sort of long, complicated series of events that I will summarize, I ended up becoming a follower of Jesus. I came to a place where I had been learning about the New Testament, reading my Bible, hanging out with Christians, going to church services, going to Campus Crusade services. And there's a day where I remember sort of coming to faith. Like, I believe that Jesus is who he said he was. I believe what the New Testament says about this figure. And so that's sort of like the next like sort of radical or like, you know, momentous point in my life. And what's interesting is that my dad had a lot of curiosity about that. Like he had this openness, and I remember him telling me that he had always seen his job as like giving my brother and I a spiritual foundation. And he said, I knew you would build on that foundation. I didn't know what it would look like. And so he had this sort of openness and curiosity about what we were both exploring. Again, my brother was on a similar journey in college, and my mom had a much harder time with it initially. She sort of thought like we didn't do a good enough job, like laying a Jewish foundation. We didn't instill Jewish values. We didn't, you know.
Yeah.
So
her life's work was that more conservative. It's funny. I don't know who in your family was more liberal or conservative, but it's the conservative desire to cement the culture, to cement the identity, to cement the civilization, and so you became uncivilized.
Yeah, yes. And she was, I wouldn't necessarily say she was threatened by that. I think she was saddened by that. I think it made her feel in some way like she had failed in, you know, and I think if I had to surmise, I don't know that this is true, it might have made her question like, oh, look, we raised our kids in this tiny podunky town instead of in Los Angeles, which is like this Jewish Mecca, you know? So I think it caused a lot of reflection for her. I actually remember her making an appointment with her childhood rabbi in LA. And she took me to see her childhood rabbi, like thinking that maybe the rabbi could sort of convince me otherwise, or convince me that like Jews shouldn't believe in Jesus. Like, that's not what we do. And I remember sitting there with my like Bible, including New Testament, on my lap, like talking to this rabbi. So it was really interesting that my parents reacted quite differently to that. But that was where my journey was going, you know?
Well, one last question about the sort of backstory. And part of me really doesn't even want to ask this question, but I feel an obligation given the current climate, which has radically shifted, sadly and strangely, even since you and I first met. You know, I don't know, it was 6 weeks ago, 2 months ago. And that is anti-Semitism. Did you experience any of it growing up? And what's your generalized, I'm not looking to get, you know, in any way contentious here, but your generalized observation over time of the outside world reaction to a Jewish identity?
Yeah, it's so interesting. And unfortunately, you're absolutely right that anti-Semitism, you know, I would say certainly in the last couple months, but also ever since October 7th, 2023, like anti-Semitism has just exploded worldwide. And it's interesting. I do remember having like sort of pretty vivid experience as a kid. Like I remember, you know, in Jewish homes, it's very traditional when you light a Hanukkah menorah, a Hanukkah, to put it in the windowsill. You know, like that's to sort of let our light shine. That's if you walk around Jerusalem, you see everybody's. And my mom would never put it in the windowsill. She would never allow us to put it in the windowsill. And so even as a child, I was sort of aware that like, oh, there's people in the world that don't like Jews. And that's why we sort of hide our, you know, like it was just this conscious awareness for her. And I remember
did you kind of argue with her in your head, like, Mom, it's not like that anymore kind of thing?
No, I didn't. I just sort of absorbed that as a kid. Like I sort of logged like, oh, we have to be careful about who we share our Jewishness with. And then I remember when we were in high school, my brother this is a little bit of a more vague memory for me, also because it didn't happen to me. It happened to my brother. My brother was in like a social studies class or something, and they had to do some kind of project. And one of the students in the class did this very anti-Semitic project that had to do with like Hitler and eliminating Jews or something. And my parents got wind of this, and they were right there meeting with the principal, taking care of this. And because I think my brother came home and he was like kind of timid, like, oh, this kid's doing this thing. It doesn't feel right to me. And my parents were very proactive in the educational system. We were homeschooled for a number of years growing up. And so that's another, like, again, just sort of like memory of dealing with anti-Semitism growing up. That was, again, my brother, not me. But there were these instances that sort of instilled in me this sense that like, we need to be careful about who we're sharing our identity with and how people might respond to that.
And so why is it Why has it metastasized? And especially in higher education, you're in higher education, hopefully
Yeah.
not at one where this is really vivid or occurring, but some of our institutions are of higher education. I mean, it's Supreme Court level now. It's, the president is involved, whatever you think of him. I mean, this is a big deal, and it's being addressed the way your parents addressed it with the school. It's now being addressed at a national level with
Yeah.
mixed results and in different ways.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one of the most kind of compelling, articulate ways I've heard it explained is that anti-Semitism has always taken different forms. It can take the form of being anti-Jewish religion. It can take the form, as it did in the Holocaust, of just sort of anti-Jewish identity. It doesn't matter if you're religious or not. And I think one of the strongest forms of contemporary anti-Semitism is anti-Zionism. This strong, I would say, unfair criticism of the state of Israel. And I think the media reinforces that. I think this sort of narratives of, the Palestinians, for example, as these sort of innocent, Israel, the big bad colonial power that's, right, trying to stomp out these sort of innocent minorities. I think, and it's just so, I mean, yeah, what you're saying about college campuses is extremely disturbing because, in the aftermath of October 7th, you have these nationwide and I think even outside the United States, protests on college campuses, and people were literally walking out. I mean, a lot of those were paid protesters, by the way, that were being bussed in.
Right, they're professional agitators. Let's call them.
But even for some of those college students, you have them being interviewed, and people said, "Do you know what happened on October 7th?" And they had no idea.
Right.
So this is a narrative that's being shaped, that is being made to portray the state of Israel in a particular way, that is just being consumed hook, line, and sinker with, and perpetuated really by, those at every level.
You would know more than me, but let me share my view of what Zionism is, and let me know if you feel this is semi-accurate or wrong. Zionism is simply the religiously derived or religiously encouraged focus on self-determination and the desire for a homeland, which for any other people on earth, we celebrate and view as a sacred right. But for some reason, for the Jews, it's the opposite.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a complete double standard. And I think if we look at the history of the wars since the modern state of Israel was founded, most of those are defensive wars on behalf. And this is why, it's crazy to me that people sort of hyper focus on the state of Israel without looking at the broader region and the sort of regional politics and the way in which, like, every single one of Israel's neighbor is committed to wiping them off the map. And yet that's not the way that the conversation goes, So I agree with you.
So we touched on it, and that's enough for now, because on this show, we try to avoid being political in any way. But when we come back from this break, which is coming up, we're going to dive into a little bit the theology of it, which is more, in my opinion, more important and more valuable. And that's your area of focus. And I want to get your perspective on a number of things that I've noodled around on as an amateur theologian. So again, what an honor to have you here, Jen. Everyone else, don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this commercial break to learn about Jen's life's work and what she's doing now on Created in the Image of God.
In a world where religions often talk past each other, what if we just sat down and listened? Facets of One is a simple devotional, bringing together scripture from the world's faiths, centered on one truth. God is one. From the Bible to the Quran, from Krishna to Christ, each voice speaks in turn, without argument, without division. You don't have to agree on everything. Just be willing to pray, to listen, and to come together. If you're longing for something deeper than noise and division, this is a different kind of conversation. Facets of One. Many voices, one God. Will you start a circle?
Welcome back to Created in the Image of God with Jen Rosner. We've learned that she was raised Jewish and how that was and how it is. We didn't really talk about her credentials. She serves as the affiliate associate professor of systematic theology at Fuller Theological Seminary. She teaches at several other colleges and universities in that area. And for the audience, I have an association with Fuller Seminary because my undergraduate degree in theology was just down the road from that in Pasadena at a small thing called Ambassador College. And some of our professors, they were, getting their credentials at Fuller, and some of the students went on to study at Fuller. So there's a close association there that is really interesting. So let's dive into now this theological aspect. So Jen, you became a Christian. We talked about how that impacted your family life, your parents accepting it, kind of sad about it, on your dad and your mom. But how did your life transform? And I want to focus emotionally on that moment, because as a Jewish person, coming to realize that Jesus is who he said he was, that had to be like mind blowing.
Yeah, I mean, it was. And it's interesting because I would say in college, college for me was a real searching time. As I mentioned, I was attending these different sort of Christian events and services. All of my friends were Christians. I do remember attending the Hillel chapter, which is like a Jewish student group on campuses, to sort of try to foster Jewish community. And I just remember it being very secular. And I had all these burning spiritual questions, and that was not what they were talking about at Hillel, And so I feel like the Jewish piece of my identity was kind of left dangling in college. It wasn't being fed. I even remember, it's interesting, I was a political science major in college, planning to go on to law school. And for all of my electives, I took religion classes because I was so fascinated. And so I took a class on Christianity by a local pastor who later became a very dear friend of mine. And I just ate it up. And I took a class on Judaism. They had an elective on Judaism that was taught by a local rabbi. And I just remember even the tenor of the class was just kind of low energy and not that engaging. And so it was just all these I did try to engage my Jewish identity, but it was just a little bit falling flat. Whereas there was sort of all this energy and momentum as I was learning about Christianity and learning about Jesus. And so I, in becoming a follower of Jesus, I didn't know what to do with the Jewish part of myself. I didn't know any other Jewish followers of Jesus. I didn't know any other Jews who were interested in talking about spiritual things. All of my friends sort of thought it was special that I was Jewish. And, they would be like, oh my gosh, God's chosen people, the 144,000, and I was like, whoa, I didn't want to be different. I didn't want to be singled out. And so really, because of all those factors, I kind of just put my Jewish identity on the shelf. I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know how it fit into this. At that time, Jesus was not something that connected to Judaism for me. Jesus was this other thing who was the center figure of Christianity. And I was comfortable wading into that, but I didn't see how any of that related to Judaism. For me, that was a completely separate thing. And I didn't know how to make sense of them. So I ended up scrapping my plans to go to law school because I was just completely hooked by all this religion, theology, Bible stuff. And so I did not go to law school, and I sort of switched tracks and I went to divinity school instead. I took a year off in between my bachelor's and my master's. I was very young. I was only 20 when I graduated with my bachelor's. And I just thought, I can't be in grad school as a 20-year-old. I can't even drink at a pub. How is this going to work? So I took a year off. I stayed in my college town. I got a job, and I read everything I could get my hands on. I read through the entire Bible. I read, all these theology books that people were recommending. And then, so 1 year after I graduated with my bachelor's, I went to Yale Divinity School and began a 3-year MDiv degree because I just wanted more of this. And I was like a kid in a candy shop taking Greek and Hebrew and church history and systematic theology. And, I remember I had this very feisty Jewish woman who was our Hebrew teacher, who was the cantor at the local, conservative synagogue. And she would have us in her home and she would feed us and teach us Hebrew. And so I feel like during my master's program, these little bits of Jewish identity began to kind of clamor for attention. And I began to realize that I had left something behind in just sort of, setting aside Judaism. And I was attending different churches. I kind of bounced around different denominations. I ended up in an Episcopal church when I was in divinity school. But I began to feel, again, sort of something inside of me saying, you've left something really important behind. And it was through, again, a sort of series of events when I was in my MDiv program related to my cousin. In fact, my first cousin, her mother was not Jewish and her father was Jewish. And she was kind of on her own journey. I was living in New Haven, Connecticut. She was living in New York City at the time. So we were like an hour and a half train ride away, and we would take the train back and forth to see each other. And she decided to go through an Orthodox conversion process to Judaism. And so here she was, like, falling in love with Judaism, falling in love with God. And here I was, like, not sure what to do with my Judaism, studying Christian theology. And it was really through my relationship with her during that season that I just really began to say, like, wow, Judaism is this part of me. It's this part of my identity. It's this part of my history and heritage and family and lineage that I need to press back into. So I finished my MDiv. I came back to California to pursue my PhD at Fuller Seminary. I sort of didn't know what to do with all of this. And my doctoral advisor at Fuller Seminary, his name was Howard Lowen. He's retired by now. But he sat me down and he said, Jen, it's really significant that you're Jewish. He's the first person that ever said this to me as a Christian. He said, it really matters that you're Jewish. It impacts the way that you will approach Christian theology. And he sort of encouraged me to press into that and to pay attention to that, as opposed to just sort of doing Christian things and putting the Jewish identity on the shelf. He was the one who really sort of told me, like, take it back off the shelf. Let it be a part of this journey and this process and this education. And so my first year at Fuller, Howard Lowen, my doctoral advisor, introduced me to someone named Mark Kinzer, who is one of the leading Messianic Jewish theologians in the world. And he, at the time, was coming to Pasadena on a regular basis. And so, here I am, first year doctoral student, trying to figure all these things out. I sit at a coffee shop across from Mark Kinzer, and we just sort of share our stories. And he assures me that there are lots of other people like us out there, and begins to kind of invite me into these spaces that are Messianic Jewish spaces where everybody's Jewish followers of Jesus, and we're all sort of trying to figure it out. And so it was really during my doctoral program that the Jewish part of my identity resurfaced and was kind of nurtured and given space to grow. And I had dialogue partners to figure that out. And so my doctoral dissertation, which was then published as my first book called Healing the Schism, was really became an opportunity for me in sort of a structured academic way to wrestle through all of these identity questions that I was having about Judaism and Christianity, and how do you make sense of them, and how do we make sense of the history between them, and how do we make sense of the remarkable developments that we're seeing in the 20th and 21st centuries, where you have, Jews rethinking Christianity and Christianity rethinking and Christians rethinking Judaism. And by that point, I was like, this is it. Like, this is my place in the world. So yeah, that sort of leads up to my kind of vocational trajectory ever since then. And as I said, and as you said, kind of finding this space of trying to exist between these two worlds very much.
Well, so thank you so much. I just absolutely love the passion and enthusiasm that you bring to this. You're just like fully engaged with a bigger reality. It resonates with me because that's my life is exactly like that, right? Wanting to climb to the top of Mount Everest and see the whole picture, right? So, couple of questions in that regard. So, obviously, two worlds here on Earth, but in heaven, there's only one world, right? And so. And again, I don't want to get political when I ask this question at all. There's a way we could address it politically. That's not what I want to do. I want to address it prophetically and from the Bible and theologically, right? So the Bible, it's 40 books from the Jewish faith and 26 New Testament books, right? So it's well over half, almost 2/3 Jewish. The whole Bible is about Israel. Even the New Testament talks a lot about Israel. I could go so far to say that, in the Adam and Eve and the Cain and Abel story, you have the seed of later, Jacob and Esau, right? It's all one whole cloth in God's view, right? And so all this differentiation, all this identity distinguishing, it's part of God's plan. But God is one. Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God, the Lord is one. I've a little plug for something I'm working on. It's called Facets of One. I took the Shema and I said, I bet that's unique in the world's religions. It turns out it's not. Every single one and every religious tradition has something similar to the Shema. But it's not, it doesn't have the identity aspect of Israel. But it emphatically states there is one God. And we think of these polytheistic religions. They're not really polytheistic at all. Hinduism, those gods, they're not gods. Those are attributes of the one God. You follow me? They're manifestations of the one true God.
Yeah.
So we, Christians would judge these as being, pagan polytheists. No. There's one God, sends rain on the just and the unjust alike, and has constantly nurtured his children from Adam and Eve onward, right? And we have all these stories. They're all in the Bible about how we as human beings, I mean, King David committing adultery and murdering the husband of the wife he committed adultery with, and yet still being called a man after God's own heart. And the core message of Matthew, in my opinion, is do not judge. It's all about judgment and telling us that we are not the judge, right? And the work of the devil is to accuse the brethren, right? So all this judgment is doing Satan's work, not God's work, right? And let God sort it out. In heaven, there's oneness, there's unity, there's harmony. There's diversity, which is your parents' example is a wonderful one, right? Of two mirror images. Anyway, what am I getting at here? Well, here's what I'm getting at. As a Jewish person who's become Christian and accepted Jesus, now when you read the Bible, you have an open-minded view to things like Isaiah, where it says, I will set up a banner for the nations and I will gather the Jews and the remnant of Israel. And you're, I assume, familiar with the fact that the first time the word Jews is mentioned in the Bible, they're at war with Israel, right? Because there were two nations, the southern and the northern kingdom, and now the Jews are at war with Israel. So the Jews are not all of Israel, and there's this concept. So my point is, looking at that, and now looking at the world, and looking at how God is working out his prophetic plan, and the establishment of the United Nations and the initial Jewish provisional government, both in 1948. Why do I mean, well, not the United Nations, but rather the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was established in 1948, and the Provisional State of Israel in 1948. There's your hypocrisy. There's your reason why that double standard against the Jews is so meaningful, because in Matthew 25, the parable of the sheep and the goats basically cribs from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and says, this is how I will judge the nations. Are you adhering to your own standard? Because Matthew says, whatever standard of judgment you set up, that's how I'm going to judge you. This is unfolding on a global scale right now. So, with your, theological work, how do you approach the Bible and these kinds of things,
Yeah, no, it's I appreciate the commentary on that. And it's a great question. I mean, and I think this is where, for me, I said that when I became a follower of Jesus in college, the two were completely separate for me, which I think is Judaism and Christianity were separate things. Jesus didn't at that time connect at all to Judaism for me. And I think, as I've learned in my own journey, and particularly in my doctoral program, like, that's the way that the world approaches these two religious traditions. They're separate religious traditions, and I think, as you're saying, that's that's a legacy that's been bequeathed to us by a very complex history between Gentile Christianity and God's ongoing covenant with the Jewish people. And we have, the sort of so-called parting of the ways.
I love that you said his ongoing covenant, because that's exactly what I believe. It is not over. They have not yet fully fulfilled their covenant with God. God has kept his promise, and now they are keeping theirs for the first time in history, because they've traditionally failed to keep their covenant.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the whole point. Like, I think that, as you said, the Bible from beginning to end is about God's covenant with the people of Israel, and how through Jesus, the long foretold Messiah of Israel, the nations are then also grafted in to covenant relationship with God. So these are the ways that I began to understand the connection between these two, religious covenant communities in my doctoral years. And I think I always feel so amazed at the time in which we're living, and the time in which, we're engaging in these kinds of conversations, because it's a remarkable era in human history, in the sort of aftermath of key 20th century events. World War II, the Holocaust, the foundation of the modern state of Israel, the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. You have this kind of really a wholesale, global, large-scale reevaluation of the relationship between Judaism and Christianity. And so it was just, again, it was so remarkable to be engaging, and it still is. This is still what I'm doing, but as a doctoral student, to be engaging in this research about, again, Christians who are thinking in new ways and having their eyes opened anew to God's covenant with the Jewish people. Again, I would say largely on account of these key 20th century events. And then Jews who are beginning to think differently about Christianity. Maybe Christianity is not necessarily inherently anti-Jewish. Maybe that's not how it started. And, one of the things that we've also seen is this emergence of a whole school of New Testament scholars who are Jewish. Some of them are Messianic Jews, but many of them are not. And there's some of the leading voices in contemporary New Testament scholarship, people like Mark Nanos and Paula Fredrickson and Pamela Eisenbaum. This whole school, which has, one umbrella way to think about these scholars is what's called the Paul within Judaism school. So, the traditional interpretation of Paul for hundreds of years, and then sort of solidified by Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation, is like Paul against Judaism, like Paul.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, don't get me started on, the law is nailed to the cross.
Yes, exactly. But that's how Paul was understood. Like, that became the traditional understanding of Paul. And it's really in the last 50 years that we're seeing this whole shift in New Testament scholarship of, like, Paul never stopped being a Torah observant Jew. Paul never saw God abrogating his covenant with the people of Israel. And so, again, it's remarkable.
But he practiced his Judaism in an amazing way as a Christian. Somebody just shared with me, and I'd never thought of this. You probably know this. Paul was an itinerant preacher, right? Why was he robbed? Well, because he was carrying bags of money around for the poor saints in Jerusalem, right? So his life work was to actually live the gospel.
Yes, and Paul said,
as a Jew.
Yes, Paul says in
Christian.
the book of Acts, present tense, I am a Pharisee. And it's remarkable to me how much in, like, contemporary Christian sermons, like, the Pharisees are always the bad guys, right? The Pharisees are legalistic, which is like a dirty word in Christianity. And so we've kind of created these types of, like, Judaism, legalism, carnal, works righteousness, bad, Christianity, spiritual, grace, faith, freedom, all these tropes that are kind of being demolished when we begin to see that that's later historical developments being read back into the text, as opposed to what the text is actually saying. And so, I always feel, as I said, just kind of in awe at the time in which we're living. There's a prayer in Judaism called the Shehechianu blessing. And it's just like thanking God for allowing us to live to this moment, and I always say that in my classes. I recite the Shehechianu when we begin to study these things, because I think we're just living in such a remarkable era in terms of these kind of, again, these tropes where Judaism and Christianity are mutually exclusive. They're defined historically in contradistinction to one another. The central, tenets of Christianity become exactly the opposite of Judaism. I mean, that's history. That's real. We can't deny that. But we're living in an era where we're beginning to see that as historical developments and not as biblical doctrine or the intention or the understanding of the biblical authors. And that's just completely remarkable to me.
Fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing that. I hadn't realized that was going on in that theological space. I'm very encouraged by that, and I want to get more involved. I want you to maybe make a couple of introductions to some of these people, because I'd love to continue this discussion on this show. When we come back from the commercial break, we're going to ask, where are you growing next? But I'm going to have one more question first on sort of where we are now, and that is to talk about a Jewish tradition called Purim. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more of Jen Rosner on Created in the Image of God.
What if everything you thought about healing was missing one vital piece? 7 generations of doctors, one man who took a different path. Betty Carmichael never went to med school, but he discovered something that science can't always explain: a spiritual process with the power to heal. Inside one of the nation's toughest recovery centers, he tested a 3-step spiritual method to address the real root of suffering, what he calls the prayer of freedom. An unexpected result happened. Nearly 90% of participants walked away healed in under a week. Now he's sharing this powerful process with the world, one that works regardless of religion or belief. Discover the prayer of freedom and unlock the life you were meant to live.
Welcome back to Created in the Image of God. Sadly, we're at the last segment, but this is an exciting one. We're going to learn about where Jen is growing next, what's next on the horizon with all this. But we mentioned right before the break, want to talk about Purim. And some in the audience probably have no clue why I'm bringing this up. Tell us what Purim is and why it's important today.
Yeah, I mean, Purim is it's a Jewish holiday that Jews all over the world celebrate, that's rooted in the book of Esther, the story of the book of Esther, where we sort of relive in Jewish communities worldwide. You read the book of Esther. It's a celebratory time, remembering the way in which God is sort of working behind the scenes all the time to defend, protect, and sort of promulgate the life of the Jewish people. And we just celebrated Purim in a couple weeks ago, and it was a pretty remarkable time for Jews, because whatever we think of the current war with Iran, the Ayatollah was killed just a couple days before Purim, and modern day Iran is ancient Persia, and so it was a lot of Jewish communities were remarking on how uncanny it was that the story of Esther tells the story of this wicked Persian man in power in the ancient world, and here we're sort of seeing again playing out in the contemporary Middle East, the sort of taking down of a leader in Iran who was certainly bent against, intent on killing the Jewish people. So it was a particularly interesting Purim this year, where there was lots of connections being made between the story that's told in the book of Esther and this holiday of Purim, and what was, what is going on in our world today. So really interesting, again, to sort of reflect upon the connections there.
Well, and my relationship with understanding of the book of Purim has been to know that it's fascinating in that God is never mentioned in that story, right? And that was always interesting, and I correlated that when I read Richard Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, right? And I correlated with the Holocaust, knowing that because the typical Jewish question is, where's God in all this, right? Well, the book of Esther, you would say, where's God in all this? God is never mentioned. So that was always kind of like what helped me understand what the Holocaust was. Because it was, and there's no understanding it, but then I want to understand it, right? Where's God? Well, God isn't mentioned because he's not, right? He's not seen. You mentioned behind the scenes. So, but there's another aspect that really just now clicked, and I don't know if this, probably people have written about this. I've never read about it. Again, I'm not a formal theologian. I haven't read and studied as much as others, but it seems like to me in this moment that the Queen Esther, well, that's the relationship between God and Israel. So in the story of Esther, the king is not the king of Iran, really, it's God. And Haman is like the evil leader, right? So in that sense, Haman being the equivalent of the Ayatollah, makes total sense because the actual ruler is God.
Yeah, I'm sure. I don't know if others have said that, but I think there's a lot of interesting Jewish commentary on the book of Esther and sort of the sort of reversals that take place throughout the book, and the
exactly. It's all political, right? It's 100% political, right? But doesn't it make sense? Because the Lord took Israel out into the wilderness to woo her back, right? And Israel is wedded to God in that sense, and just like the church is the bride of Christ, right? So in that sense, the king of Persia was not really the king of Persia in that parable story, and it's probably a true story. I mean, I assume it may be a true story, or maybe it's fable. I don't know. Maybe it's a Jewish children's story to help the kids. I don't know. What's the belief in the literal historicity of the book of Esther?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I would say that, most traditional Jewish communities believe that it actually happened, that it was an actual story, that we're remembering as we celebrate the holiday. I mean, there's probably those who would say it was fable, but I think the more traditional Jewish communities would say that it was a real story.
But like a real story, and this is the way with prophecy, there's always a literal and a spiritual fulfillment, right? So anyway, having said all that, just fascinating time, to your point of the timing of this and what's happening in Iran, and you have now a Jewish state and a nominally largely Christian state, although we have freedom of religion, but they do in Israel as well. We don't declare ourselves to be in any formal way a Christian state, but we kind of are, right? Still, to a degree. And anyway, these two nations going together to accomplish this, it's really quite unbelievable. So moving on from all that, where are you growing next? I mean, you're out teaching in a variety of ways. We haven't really talked about your teaching work, but a lot of it has come through in how you approach these things. But are there specific things that you're realizing and teaching, certain lines of thought or interaction or programs that you want to endorse moving forward or advocate for or promote? And is there a new book on the horizon for you? What's next for Jen?
Yeah, it's a great question. I should say, I guess I'll start by saying my most recent book was published in 2022. It's called Finding Messiah, A Journey into the Jewishness of the Gospel. It was the first book that I've done that was not an academic book. It was just geared as a trade book. It's geared towards, Christians in pews. That was the target audience. And the book is kind of one part memoir, like telling my story, and one part kind of biblical, theological, historical reflections on the kinds of things that we've been talking about, the parting of the ways between Judaism and Christianity, the era in which we're living, in which, New Testament scholarship is increasingly focusing again on the Jewishness of the New Testament, the Jewishness of Jesus, the Jewishness of Paul. And it was a really fun book to write. And one of the kind of key questions from early readers of Finding Messiah, Christians, interested Christians, engaged Christians, was, okay, if we as Gentile, as non-Jewish Christians kind of buy into all of this, if we agree with what you're saying, what now? So what? What do we do with that? Should we start having Christian Passover Seder's? Should we start celebrating a Saturday Sabbath? How do we engage with, my argument about, again, the irrevocability of God's covenant with the people of Israel, these kinds of things? And I think it's a really important question. I may have said I spent a lot of time in the Messianic Jewish movement. That's sort of the movement that I would consider to be my spiritual home. And there's a big question in the Messianic Jewish movement today about, Jewish and Gentile identity in the movement. Is it, how are we to live in obedience to God, to Jesus, as Jews and as Gentiles? And I think, what I've increasingly, discovered in my own life and in my own work is that doesn't necessarily look the same for Jews and Christians. I believe that, Jews are called to a certain way of life that is, the pattern of Torah, the pattern of Jewish life cycle events, Jewish holidays. and that Gentiles are not called to that. And we see, a strong precedence for this in the New Testament.
Yeah, it's the question of circumcision in the New Testament, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. So key texts like Acts 15, the Jerusalem Council in the New Testament, where you have these Jewish, followers of Jesus saying that all these Gentiles who want to follow Jesus need to be circumcised and need to live as Jews, and they create this whole council, and they end up saying no. Gentiles do not need to become Jewish in order to follow Jesus. And they base that on the precedence of the Spirit coming upon Gentiles in Acts 10, the same way that it came upon Jews in Acts 2. And so
but the reverse isn't true there. There was no conclusion and Jews should stop keeping the Sabbath, right?
Absolutely.
That came later. You must not Judaize.
Yes, and in fact, the question doesn't even make sense. If Jews were to stop living as Jews, then why would we even be asking if Gentiles should live as Jews, right? And then you have key texts like 1 Corinthians 7, where Paul says, stay in the position where God has put you. If you're circumcised, do not become uncircumcised. If you're uncircumcised, do not become circumcised. So you have these key places in the New Testament where we see that Jews continue to follow Jesus as Jews, and Gentiles are not to become Jewish. They don't have to. There's not advantages. You don't get to be closer to God by being Jewish. That's the whole point, that in Jesus, Gentiles are accepted as Gentiles. And so this is a big question in the Messianic Jewish movement, because I think, one way that these conversations can go about learning about the Jewish history of the Christian faith and of the New Testament is that then we can say, well, then the church is pagan. Constantine was a pagan. Martin Luther was anti-Semitic. Christian holidays are pagan. We need to just go away from all that and go back to the Bible.
I'm glad you raised that, because I was about to. I wasn't going to use the word pagan at all, because I don't go there these days. We used to in the Worldwide Church of God. That was all pagan, right? All of Christianity was pagan. We were the one true church, right? That was many years ago, many decades. Don't call anyone. I'm good, today. But the question remains, because I've still to this day have a problem with this. Nowhere do we have any indication that we're supposed to celebrate Jesus's birthday. It could be inferred and implied, but it could also be inferred and implied that we aren't supposed to celebrate birthdays at all. In the Worldwide Church of God, we didn't celebrate birthdays. You want to know why? Because it was Salome's birthday where John the Baptist was beheaded, right? It was we had this interpretation of Job that when the sons came together to celebrate their day, they were celebrating their birthday when they were all wiped out. And birthdays were selfish, celebration of the self, elevation of the self. And so we didn't celebrate birthdays at all. And we didn't celebrate Christmas because Jesus never said, and plus Christmas, Jesus wasn't born on December 25th. That's where the pagan thing comes in, which I don't want to go there. But also the pagan thing comes in with Easter eggs and Ishtar, right? For Easter. But again, Jesus didn't say that we should be celebrating his resurrection. He, in fact, instructed his disciples to celebrate the Passover with new symbols. And he said, do this in remembrance of me with the foot washing. So guess what? We did the foot washing and Passover as Christians, right? And that was so moving and so powerful to read those verses from the Bible and then perform the foot washing, to read those verses from the Bible and then perform the Passover, right? So we never celebrated Easter and Christmas. My point in bringing it up here isn't to create the theological debate, although maybe to plant a seed for discussion. I don't know if that discussion is going on anywhere, but more importantly, the divergence happens because we start having different religious practices. Your mom was very focused on the religious practices. Your dad was more, like this. Your mom was disappointed when you went away from those religious practices. Your dad was more positive, right? So it's the divergence of holy days and celebrating on different days of the week that actually began to divide the people.
Yeah, no, it's true. It absolutely did. And I think, I am working on a current book. The tentative title is The Jewish Gospel and Christian Identity. So really trying to think through how does, again, all the things that I continue to write and teach about the Jewishness of the New Testament, God's ongoing covenant with the people of Israel, how should Gentile Christians respond to that? And I'm actually in this current book, tapping into sort of contemporary Christian missiology, missions efforts and mission theology around the world, which, for a long time was this Western colonial endeavor where we, Christians from the West went to, the East and the South and tried to make everybody look like little Westerners. We exported Christianity, commerce, and culture and tried to civilize. There was this kind of really unfortunate sort of damaging legacy of colonial Christianity. And now, again, in the latter half, particularly of the 20th century, you see Christian missiology moving towards this model of kind of ennobling cultural particularity, where missionaries are kind of like midwives to help the gospel find a unique expression and unique incarnation in every culture and context that it encounters. So not making Nigerians look like Europeans, but helping Nigerians or Koreans or, whoever to try to find unique indigenous expressions of the gospel, believing that that Christianity is not a Western religion, but that it's a religion that is to take root in every context and culture. And so, I'm really thinking about that as, and there's a very famous 20th century Jewish philosopher named Franz Rosenzweig who gives us this beautiful imagery of Judaism as kind of his magnum opus is called the Star of Redemption. And he gives this imagery of like a celestial star, where Judaism is the kind of burning core of the star. And the goal of the Jewish people is just to sort of perpetuate this life of obedience and submission to God. And the role of Christianity is then to sort of, it's like the rays of the star, where Christianity takes the heat and the light from this inner burning core and brings it to every corner of the world. And I think there's so much to be gained from that as we think about Gentile identity. So I'm actually, I think some Gentiles, and I talk about this in my book, are called to come into unique proximity to Jewish life and the Jewish people. And I'm sort of trying to tease out what that kind of calling looks like. But my argument is that the vast majority of Gentile Christians are to be like the rays of that star, who are bringing the gospel message to the ends of the earth, understanding that Christianity and the Christian message and the life and death and resurrection and ascension of Jesus is rooted in God's covenant with Israel, but helping again, people on the four corners of the earth to find unique expressions that take their own identity seriously, not for everybody to start living as Jews. So that's where I spend a lot of my time these days, is sort of thinking through Jewish and Gentile identity in the body of Messiah, trying to preserve these New Testament categories whereby Gentiles are accepted as Gentiles, and sort of encouraging Gentiles to press into their unique stories and heritage and identity, and Jews, are following Jesus as Jews. So that's the place where I spend most of my working time and most of my up at 2 a.m, can't fall asleep, because I'm sort of puzzling over these questions that have a unique, urgency in the Messianic Jewish movement, where we are wrestling with, congregations that are made of Jews and Gentiles, trying to raise, children in these congregations, and it makes me sad if anybody thinks that it's better to be Jewish, right? That you're a little bit closer to God if you're Jewish, or that you're a little bit more biblical if you're Jewish, because I think that's exactly the opposite of the message of the New Testament.
But does the reverse hold true? Are you a little bit closer to God if you're Christian?
I mean, so it's an interesting question. I mean, I think that, Jesus is the Messiah of Israel and the Lord of the nations, right? So there's this aspect of following Jesus as the way, the truth, and the life. I'm not opposed to sharing the gospel, right. But I do think we need to pay attention. And this is where I think contemporary missiology is so helpful, because it's really trying to take seriously particular Gentile identity in this case. One of my good friends is an Asian American theologian at Fuller Seminary, and all of his work has to do with Asian American Christianity. What does it mean specifically to be an Asian American Christian? And I think the work that he's doing, his most recent book, his name's Daniel Lee, his most recent book is called Doing Asian American Theology. And he's pressing into what it means to follow Jesus as an Asian American. But what he does that very few theologians do is he says any discussion of cultural particularity, unique identity has to ultimately be rooted in understanding Jesus's Jewish identity. So I think there's so much to sort of unpack here.
There you go. So yeah, to me, that was kind of a trick question. I believe it's true personally. I mean, and again, my opinion isn't necessarily the right one, but how I view it, I believe it's true that it's maybe a little easier in a way to be a little bit closer to God if you know the identity of Jesus. But that doesn't mean every Christian is closer to God than every Jew. That's ridiculous, because it's, as Jesus said so many statements, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and don't do the things that I say, right? And Paul, talked about the Gentiles being a law unto themselves if they keep the law apart, without knowing, and he honored the statue to the unknown God, right? And so you have, it's very individual at the same time that God has a plan that he's orchestrating. And as we, to me, and we're out of time, but I'm going to bring this one last thing up and then give you the final word. I've come to the conclusion that in the Garden of Eden, it's like one of those FBI movies where you're hauled in and you're sitting at the table and there's a glaring light on you, and there's an interrogator, and somebody else comes in and says, we can do this the easy way or we can do it the hard way. And we chose to do it the hard way, right? We ate of the tree that God said no. And had we eaten of the tree of life and just drank in from the word of God from the start, it could have been easier. But it was never going to be easy, because the road to maturity is long and hard. And this is why Paul says, to the Hebrews, strong meat belongs to those who by reason of use have exercised their senses to discern good and evil. Jesus flipped the scripts on everything. His parables flipped the script. I believe the prodigal son is a flipping of the script of Cain and Abel. We may have talked about that. Don't want to unpack that. It takes some thinking, but Paul is now flipping the script on the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and he's saying you now need to eat of that tree. He's literally saying you now need to eat of that tree. Why? Because Jesus is the second Adam. There's the theological grounding. I brought this up with Ellen Cherry, and she's like, that's not biblical. I'm like, well, I'm reading the Bible. It might not be theologically correct. That's a question, but it is biblical, right? There's obviously a correlation. He uses discern good and evil, and that's what the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was all about. You will become like God, knowing good and evil. And he's saying you need to, by reason of the use of your senses, discern good and evil, right? So it's a long row to hoe. And that's what God told Adam. You will have a long row to hoe. The earth will produce thorns and thistles, and you'll have to fight it. And and Eve, your desire will now be your husband. He will rule over you. It's going to be tough. It's going to be hard. But you'll get there the hard way, just like you would have gotten there the easier way, which would have also been hard.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll just comment on that, and I know we're out of time here, but it reminds me, I was talking a moment ago about Franz Rosenzweig, this kind of, famous 20th century Jewish philosopher. There's a more recent book by a Catholic theologian named Paul Griffiths. The book is called Israel, Christian Grammar, and he's sort of trying to unpack how Christians should think about Israel and God's covenant with Israel and Judaism and Christianity and these kinds of things. And it's fascinating because, to your point about we chose the harder way, what Franz Rosenzweig sort of says implicitly and Paul Griffiths says explicitly is that somehow this parting of the ways between Judaism and Christianity, which I view as like a historical tragedy, a great schism in the people of God, these authors want to say that somehow that was also in the plan and purposes of God, that is part of the redemptive journey of God's people. And somehow, each community has something to learn and something to offer from the other. And each community will sort of learn something from this schism between them that they couldn't have learned otherwise. And so it's this very hopeful reading of history where we can say it didn't have to be that way, but God is using this for redemption, which I think is just so, so beautiful and powerful and complex,
Awesome. So what final words would you leave for the audience today?
Yeah, I mean, I again, it's what an enjoyable conversation this has been. And I think that, as we've talked about my own journey, you've shared a little bit about your journey. I think I would just encourage listeners to press into the particulars of your own to listeners' spiritual journeys. I think there's so much value in reflecting upon our unique identity, our unique stories, taking time to sort of ponder and press into that, because I think that's where we find sort of the pathway that God is laying before us. It doesn't have to do with someone else's life. It has to do with our lives, And so I hope that, hearing bits of your story and my story can sort of inspire listeners to think about the significance and the uniqueness and the particularity of their own stories as, the place where we find and meet with God.
Thank you so much. That's a perfect segue into my final tagline to the audience. You are created in the image of God, and God loves his creation, particularly you. So Jen, thank you so much for being here. You will get an invite to come back. I want to continue. There's so many more questions and topics to discuss. For the rest of the audience, stay tuned. There's a sneak peek coming of who you will have to enjoy next week. And we'll see you all there at the same time, same place for Creating the Image of God. Hey everyone, Wade Franson here with an exciting sneak peek. I have an amazing guest in the studio today. His name is Konstantin Samopoulos, and he is a leading figure in the field of bioethics. His focus is on overall well-being and abundant life, human flourishing, and the intersection of our view of medicine and doctors. Welcome to the studio, Konstantin.
Thank you so much for having me, Wade. Wonderful to be here.
Well, right before we clicked the record button, we were having this fascinating conversation in which you brought up the example of the Good Samaritan. Jesus in his day came to a fervently religious group under a large occupying power. They were expecting him to come and free them up from the dominion of an outside power, and his teachings, he said, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. How does the parable of the Good Samaritan fit into that?
Yeah, thank you. That's a wonderful question, and you're leading me to my favorite parable as a Christian, an Orthodox Christian myself, very ecumenically minded one. I think it is really the crux of all of medicine and healthcare. And it could give us, especially today in this day and age, and in the United States, but globally more than ever, an idea of how we can really have medicine and all of healthcare and public health reimagined. From the specific impetus being that Jesus Christ really tells us in this parable by Luke on who is actually going to care about their neighbor, and then specifies who that neighbor is. So what we're really lacking in medicine, and we see that in bioethics, is this soul of care. Who is going to understand that really our neighbor is not in this figuratively, but also metaphorically meaning, rather than just the literal meaning of the actual neighbor. It is anyone in close proximity to us. And if we believe that we're created in the image, and as we say in the Orthodox tradition, the likeness as well of God, we have to realize that what is the most meaningful to consider in medicine, but also all of healthcare, is the human dignity of the other person who is in close proximity to us. That's what Christ wanted us to do.
Awesome. So a question that most people are focused on, however, is like the big picture, right? Global universal health care. And these are big questions, but what I'm hearing from you is a need to focus on the personal, the individual doctor, and the relationship with the patient at this, let's call it the cellular level, versus the societal policy level. And both are important, but how do you deal with those two sides of it?
Absolutely. And I can tell you a very brief example from my favorite professor when I was a student at Harvard Medical School, the late Paul Farmer, co-founder of the Partners in Health, a global enterprise based on the notion that we should care especially for those who are the destitute, poor, and sick of the world. and those really need us the most. And what he said was he despised any notion of cost effectiveness or utilitarian kind of thinking when it comes to medicine, looking at just numbers or statistics and not the individual. We have to look into the person. And so first the person, and then, of course, his or her body and soul holistically. But starting with who is the patient, who is the person that we have in front of us, and that is where our focus should be and ought to be before any kind of financial concerns or time constraints. This is all constructed. Those are constructs rather than the essence of what we should be doing, first as people in medicine, scientists in academia, but also as human beings in society. We really need it in the United States especially, but the whole world over as today.
Two hugely important views and perspectives on this topic, and during the whole hour that we will have together, we'll have the time to cover much more. So everyone listening into this sneak peek, you do not want to miss next week's show with Konstantin Simopoulos on April 14th on Created in the Image of God, 8 p.m. Central. We will see you there.